The wind howled through the empty streets of Portland, rain coming down in fierce, icy sheets that rattled the windows of Willow Creek Animal Rescue. It was well past midnight, but Dr. Naomi was still awake, just as she always was on stormy nights, pacing the linoleum floors of the shelter with her cup of jasmine tea. The animals, sensing her calm presence and the distant thunder, had mostly settled in. Only the drip of rain and the occasional whimper from the new arrivals broke the silence. That fragile peace shattered with a sudden pounding on the glass. Naomi spun, heart jumping. A volunteer, soaked to the bone, staggered in, cradling a limp bundle. A German shepherd puppy, maybe 4 months old, shivering uncontrollably. The puppy's coat was muddy and ragged, his ribs sharp against Naomi's gentle hands as she took him. He barely reacted, except for one thing. His eyes, wide and wild, locked onto hers with a desperate determination that startled her. There was a kind of challenge there, a refusal to surrender to fear. Naomi saw, in an instant, something she recognized from her own childhood, a stubborn spark, refusing to be snuffed out. She wrapped the puppy in a faded blue blanket, murmuring softly. Thunder cracked so close the whole shelter seemed to tremble. The lights blinked, then vanished, plunging everything into a suffocating darkness. Naomi stood still, her breath caught, feeling the puppy's heartbeat thud wildly under her palm. His whimper, barely a sound, echoed in the darkness, a reminder that the storm outside was nothing compared to the one this animal had survived. Somewhere beyond the glass, a shape moved on the street. Naomi tensed, sensing she was being watched, but the figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Working by flashlight, Naomi began the intake exam. She whispered to the puppy, telling him her name, her hands careful but efficient. She discovered old bruises hidden beneath the fur, marks that couldn't be explained by a life on the streets. Defensive wounds on his forelegs, a fresh gash along his flank, a small notch missing from his left ear. Blitz. That was the name she gave him, after the way he looked at her. Full force, no backing down. The power came back with a sputter, just enough to hear the distant rattle of pipes and see her own reflection in the glass. Tired, wary, but unwilling to turn away. She watched Blitz's chest rise and fall, listened to his shallow breaths, and for the first time in weeks felt the tremor of purpose beneath her skin. This dog, she thought, would change everything. She moved him to the isolation room, tucking him in with a heating pad, and setting her old jade pendant beside him, a talisman she'd carried since her grandmother's death. The wind screamed, rattling the windows, but in that small, warm space, Naomi knelt beside Blitz and hummed a lullaby from her childhood. He watched her, eyes unblinking, as if memorizing the shape of her kindness. Minutes bled into hours. Naomi took notes by flashlight, cataloging every injury, every reaction. She noted how Blitz flinched at sudden sounds, but would nuzzle closer when she sang softly. The trust between them grew by inches, a slow dance of reassurance. As the storm raged outside, Naomi remembered her first rescue, a stray kitten she'd pulled from under a porch, scared and fighting for its life. That moment had planted a seed in her that nothing could ever erase. Just after 2 a.m., Naomi heard a faint scuff outside the isolation room, a deliberate, slow sound. She froze. The hair on her arms stood up. She stepped quietly to the door, peering through the crack. Nothing. The halls were empty except for the flicker of the emergency exit light and the distant murmur of rain. But as she returned to Blitz's side, a cold certainty settled in her chest. Someone had been watching the shelter that night. someone who knew the darkness better than the light. Naomi sat on the floor, back against the kennel, thinking about what it meant to trust, to give a wounded soul a chance to heal, even when the world felt hostile and uncertain. As dawn crept in, weak and gray, Blitz finally closed his eyes, drifting into a troubled sleep. Naomi promised herself she would fight for him, no matter what it cost. And outside, hidden in the rain-soaked shadows, someone waited, watching the shelter and the woman inside, already planning the next move. The storm passed, but its aftershocks lingered inside Willow Creek Animal Rescue, like a low, uneasy hum. Dr. Naomi Le hadn't really slept. The image of Blitz, wrapped tight in his blanket, eyes flickering between trust and terror, haunted her long after sunrise. She went through the motions of her morning rounds, but her mind was caught on the bruises, the old wounds, and that chilling moment when she'd sensed someone watching from the darkness. Blitz seemed different, too. The first day, he'd greeted Naomi's gentle hand with a hesitant nuzzle. He had even wagged his tail, just once, but enough for hope to flicker. But as the week wore on, a subtle change crept in. Blitz's spirit dulled. The puppy who had locked eyes with Naomi on that first desperate night now shrank from her touch at odd times. He flinched at the softest footsteps, shied away from some volunteers, and, most notably, refused to eat unless Naomi sat with him, quietly humming the lullabies of her youth. It didn't take long for Naomi to notice a pattern. Blitz would perk up for the daytime staff, especially the young volunteers, but the closer it got to midnight, the more anxious he became. When Eric Sloan, the new night supervisor, started his shift, Blitz's entire body tensed. Eric had joined Willow Creek 2 weeks ago. Impeccable resume, tidy appearance, quick to volunteer for late shifts no one else wanted. But Naomi had noticed his eyes rarely softened. Even when holding the smallest kittens, he moved through the shelter with an odd detachment, as if he were simply ticking boxes on a chart. Naomi tried to shake the suspicion. Maybe Eric was just new, awkward, careful not to step on toes, but Blitz saw something different. The puppy cowered when Eric entered the room, refused food, and pressed himself into the farthest corner of his kennel, trembling so violently Naomi thought he might be having a seizure. Other animals started showing signs, too. That Friday, a teenage volunteer named Marcus came to Naomi with worry in his voice. "Dr. Le, have you noticed? Some of the dogs act weird after Eric's shift. Sable bit her leash for the first time. Copper keeps hiding under his blanket." Naomi thanked him, trying to keep her voice steady, but dread crept through her like winter chill. She checked the shelter log. No incidents, no missing animals, nothing but perfect notes in Eric's neat handwriting. The numbers lined up, but the animals didn't. Blitz, for his part, remained fiercely protective of the other vulnerable creatures. At night, when Eric left the main room, Blitz would inch closer to the kitten's enclosure, positioning himself between them and the door. Sometimes, Naomi caught him soothing a trembling kitten or licking the wounds of a new arrival. There was a gentleness in him, a broken boy's courage, and Naomi's heart ached with both pride and fear. One evening, after a particularly tense shift, Naomi lingered in her office long after everyone else had gone. She set up a pot of strong black tea, fingers drumming the mug. Outside, the city glowed in the wet dark. She was going over Blitz's intake records, retracing every wound, every subtle change in behavior. Her office was the only place in the shelter with a working security camera, a fact she'd only realized as she absent-mindedly wiped mud from her shoes and found a tiny, perfect paw print pressed into the tile near her desk. Blitz hadn't been in her office. None of the dogs had. A chill ran down Naomi's spine. The paw print was a silent message, a tiny mark of presence or maybe a plea. She looked up at the security feed, but all she saw was her own reflection in the black screen. That night, she sat in the kennel room after hours, a notebook in her lap, Blitz pressed against her side. She wrote down everything: dates, times, staff present, any animal's shift in mood. She traced the changes in Blitz's demeanor, cross-referencing with Eric's schedule, finding patterns where no one else was looking. Naomi's mind whirred with worry and doubt. Was she just being paranoid? Was her own past, those years in foster care, when she'd gone unheard, blinding her to the truth? She caught herself trembling. Blitz nudged her hand, dark eyes searching her face for reassurance. Naomi took a slow breath, her old wounds aching in the silence. She whispered, "I won't let anyone hurt you. Not again." Word spread quietly among the volunteers. Some noticed strange things: missing toys, food bowls left in odd places, dogs trembling after midnight. But nothing they could prove. Naomi began to trust her instincts more, even when the senior staff seemed dismissive. "They're shelter animals," one said. "They're always skittish at first." But Naomi had seen the difference between fear and trauma. She'd lived it. The next afternoon, she approached the director, Teresa Bond, requesting access to the after-hours security cameras. Teresa hesitated, caught between protocol and concern. "Is there something I should know?" Naomi shook her head, unwilling to accuse without proof. "Just a feeling. And Blitz, he's telling us something, if we're willing to listen." As darkness fell, Naomi felt the weight of the shelter pressing in. She spent her night combing through paperwork, reviewing incident logs, listening to the low, nervous whines of the animals as Eric moved through the halls. Her instincts screamed at her, "Something is wrong here, something deeper than a bad night or an awkward supervisor." And out on the street, beneath a flickering streetlight, the same shadow from before lingered. Watching, waiting. Inside, Blitz huddled in his kennel, flinching at each passing footstep. Naomi made a silent promise to herself and to him. "I'll get to the truth, whatever it takes." She didn't know yet that the truth would be darker and more dangerous than anything she'd imagined. Willow Creek's halls, so alive with noise during the day, transformed at night into a labyrinth of shadows and muffled sounds. Dr. Naomi Le found herself drawn into this after-hours world, flashlight in one hand, her battered notebook in the other, unable to sleep as long as questions circled in her mind. The rain had stopped, but the tension in the shelter, like a pressure front that refused to move on, lingered in the air, thick as fog. Naomi had always been methodical, a trait learned through necessity, not nature. Growing up in a patchwork of foster homes, she'd learned how to spot subtle shifts: anger behind a caretaker's smile, sadness in the way a friend avoided eye contact. Now she used those instincts with the animals. She read their eyes, their shivers, the small betrayals of their trust. With Blitz, everything was magnified. She saw herself in him, a survivor of a world that could wound deeply and then act as if nothing had happened. That week, Naomi worked late every night, poring over intake records and vet files by the pale beam of her flashlight. She'd arranged to meet Dr. Carmen Reyes, her longtime mentor, in the shelter's back office. Carmen was the only person Naomi trusted with her worst fears. "You're not imagining things," Carmen murmured, studying Naomi's notes by the glow of her phone. "It's in the patterns. Injuries in waves, dogs refusing food, cats hiding. Something's happening on those late shifts." Naomi exhaled, relief and dread mixing in her chest. But if I accuse without proof, then trust your gut. You always have. Carmen smiled gently. Start where you can, with Blitz. Naomi took that advice to heart. She began spending extra time with Blitz after her shifts, sitting cross-legged outside his kennel, playing soft classical music on her old phone. Blitz, at first, watched her warily from his corner. Naomi didn't force him. She brought him warm blankets, slices of apple, and let him come to her in his own time. One night, as rain tapped the roof, Blitz finally shuffled over, nudging his nose against her knee. Naomi felt her throat tighten. For the first time since his arrival, Blitz ate a few bites from her hand, his eyes never leaving hers. It was a small victory, but it felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. These late-night rituals became a lifeline for them both. Naomi talked to Blitz in the dark, sharing her fears, her memories. She confessed things she hadn't spoken aloud in years. The terror of moving between foster homes, the pain of losing animals she'd fought to save, the hollow ache of not being believed. Blitz listened, silent and solemn, pressing closer when her voice broke. Naomi felt a bond forming, something raw and necessary, like a secret handshake between the wounded. But the shelter's quiet held secrets, too. Naomi became increasingly aware of subtle injuries among other animals, tiny, consistent marks that couldn't be written off as play or bad luck. A kitten with a bruised paw, a terrier with a cut on his side, a senior cat suddenly unwilling to leave her hiding spot. Naomi cataloged each injury, matching them against shift schedules and intake logs. A pattern emerged, insidious and unmistakable. Late one night, Naomi found herself alone in the surgery suite, reviewing the last month's intake photos. She highlighted wounds, scribbled notes, her mind spinning. She wondered if she was letting her own past haunt her judgment. Maybe she saw ghosts where there were none. But then she remembered the day she was placed in her final foster home, the one where she'd first learned not every adult could be trusted. She'd spent weeks collecting evidence of small cruelties, hoping someone would listen. She knew now. Sometimes patterns were all you had. One evening, Blitz did something new. As Naomi was cleaning a wound on a young beagle, Blitz squeezed out of his kennel and padded over, pressing his body between Naomi and the open door. His posture was protective, tense, alert. Naomi recognized the gesture instantly. He was watching over her, just as she watched over him. That night, she confided in Blitz. "You know what it's like not to be believed, don't you?" Blitz's eyes held hers. In that silent exchange, Naomi felt her resolve harden. She reached out to the volunteers who worked the late shifts, asking gentle, probing questions. Most shrugged, but a few, Marcus, Jamie, old Mrs. Washington, admitted they'd seen strange things. Food left untouched, dogs huddling in corners, a chill in the air after Eric passed by. Still, no one wanted to accuse a fellow staff member. Naomi wrote everything down, every whisper of suspicion, every pattern that didn't fit. On her last night before a scheduled day off, Naomi walked the kennels one last time. The shelter was quiet except for the hum of the lights and the gentle breaths of sleeping animals. Blitz, eyes bright, met her at the kennel door. She reached through the bars, brushing his muzzle with her fingertips. "We'll figure this out," she promised. He leaned into her touch, and for the first time Naomi let herself believe it. But just as she was about to leave, she spotted another faint mark, a bruise on a kitten's shoulder, one that hadn't been there the day before. Naomi's breath caught. She knew, with bone-deep certainty, that the abuse was systematic. Someone was hurting the animals when no one was watching. She locked the office door behind her, notebook clutched tight. Trust, she thought, was a fragile thing. It took courage to offer it, and even more to fight for it, when everything felt stacked against you. Outside, thunder rolled far in the distance. Inside, in the half-lit dark, trust and suspicion circled one another, waiting for dawn. The air inside Willow Creek felt denser now, thick with suspicion and unspoken fear. Dr. Naomi moved through the halls like a shadow, her every action careful, her trust reserved for only the animals, and a handful of volunteers who'd proven themselves. She could feel it in the glances exchanged by staff, the subtle tension in every conversation. The more she probed, the more she realized that not everyone was as committed to truth as she was. It was just past midnight, the shelter cloaked in hush, when Naomi quietly wheeled in a small camera from her office. She waited for the old security guard to finish his rounds, then crept into the back kennel and installed the device high in the corner, camouflaged beneath a ragged towel. Blitz, in the kennel beside her, watched every move, ears perked, his dark eyes alive with alertness and anxiety. Naomi had decided Blitz would no longer stay alone in the kennels at night. She made up a bed for him in the staff room, just off her own office, and brought his battered blanket and her old jade pendant, the one that never failed to bring her a measure of calm. For the rest of the night, she sat beside him, listening to the steady patter of his breath, the faint hum of the city outside, and the distant, unsettling creaks from the hallway. During the day, Naomi's focus sharpened. She began a quiet investigation, asking gentle but pointed questions, reviewing intake logs, and comparing notes from the volunteers who'd confided in her. When she spoke with Eric Sloan, the new night supervisor, she kept her tone light but studied his responses with surgical precision. He met her eyes, always a beat too late, and offered explanations that never quite satisfied. "Some animals just take longer to adjust, Dr. Lee. You know how it is." But Naomi knew too much to be comforted by empty reassurances. She tracked his shifts, made careful note of any injuries or behavioral changes reported by staff, and slowly, a web of gaps and inconsistencies began to emerge. Files went missing. Dogs who'd shown progress with one volunteer regressed overnight. The shelter director, Teresa Bond, started to notice too, her eyes growing darker each time Naomi handed her another list of questions, another odd coincidence. One morning, after a long, sleepless night, Naomi found a new arrival, a senior terrier, gray-muzzled and trembling, dumped at the shelter's front gate in a rain-soaked carrier. The dog wouldn't leave the corner of his kennel, eyes darting wildly, fur sticky with fear. Naomi moved Blitz into the staff room for the night and spent the next hour coaxing the terrier out from under a cot. When she finally managed to touch him, his entire body shook, and his cry was so desperate that even Blitz pressed his nose to the kennel bars, letting out a soft, mournful whine. The echo of that pain haunted Naomi for days. She couldn't ignore the parallels. Animals arriving with old wounds and new terrors, their spirits frayed. Blitz, despite his own trauma, always tried to comfort the weakest among them. Naomi watched as he carefully approached the senior terrier, lying beside him until the dog's shivering eased. It was as if Blitz understood exactly what the terrier felt. The fear, the hope, the desperate wish for a hand that wouldn't strike. That night, Naomi sat on the floor of the staff room, legs drawn to her chest, Blitz curled beside her. She thought about the feeling she'd carried her whole life, the burden of not being believed, the humiliation of knowing the truth while everyone else looked away. She could see the same doubts flickering in the eyes of her director, in the way some staff avoided her questions, their loyalty to routine outweighing their loyalty to the animals. But Naomi had something she'd never had before. Proof was just within reach. The next morning, after a week of waiting, she reviewed the footage from the hidden camera. The images were grainy, the sound muffled, but there was no mistaking what she saw. Eric, after midnight, quietly entering the kennel, removing Blitz on a short leash. Blitz's posture was tense, tail tucked, but he didn't fight. He simply looked back over his shoulder, eyes pleading. Naomi heard muted yelps, then saw Eric's hand cover the camera. The footage went dark. Naomi's breath caught, a chill running up her spine. She replayed the last moments again and again, trying to make sense of the half-heard sounds, the blurred shapes. It was evidence, not just suspicion, but a record of harm. Still, she felt alone. Would it be enough? She called Teresa into her office, heart pounding. Blitz lay at her feet, head resting on Naomi's shoe, as Teresa watched the footage in grim silence. "This can't be ignored," Teresa whispered. Naomi nodded, voice shaking. "It's not just Blitz. I think it's been going on for weeks, maybe longer." The two women made a plan. They'd move Blitz into Naomi's home for his own safety. They'd contact animal control, gather more evidence, and prepare to confront Eric. But Naomi couldn't help feeling the old ache of doubt. Memories of times she'd raised her voice and been brushed aside. She wondered if Teresa would follow through, or if fear of scandal would silence her. That night, as Blitz settled into a warm corner of Naomi's small living room for the first time, he seemed to understand the shift. He curled tightly, for the first time truly relaxing, and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Naomi watched him, heart aching with relief and fear, vowing again, this time silently, that she would not turn away, no matter what came next. Somewhere far down the hallway, Naomi heard footsteps she couldn't place. She felt the weight of every animal depending on her, every vulnerable soul who'd ever been let down by the people they'd needed most. And in that hush, Naomi knew the real hunt had just begun. The news spread quietly, as if the walls themselves whispered it. Blitz had been moved from the shelter, Naomi's expression grim and guarded as she led him out after dark. The mood inside Willow Creek Animal Rescue changed almost overnight. Staff and volunteers seemed more cautious, their conversations laced with nervous curiosity. Naomi felt their eyes following her through every corridor, but she couldn't afford to let uncertainty slow her. Too many lives depended on her resolve. The first night at home, Blitz explored Naomi's small apartment with cautious steps. He sniffed at the stack of veterinary textbooks beside her armchair, the old carpet still faintly scented of tea and lavender. Naomi made up a bed for him beside her own, just a thick quilt and her grandmother's pillow, the same one that had soothed her on anxious nights. Blitz circled twice and lay down, still tense, but as Naomi settled onto her mattress, she saw his eyes tracking her, trust battling with fear. That night, for the first time since his arrival, Blitz slept soundly. He curled at the foot of her bed, breathing slow and deep. Naomi watched the rise and fall of his ribs, her own body relaxing for the first time in weeks, but her mind never stopped working. Every detail from the hidden camera replayed in her head. Eric's hand, the muffled yelps, the darkness. The evidence was damning, but was it enough to move those in power? Would they listen? Or would the truth be drowned in the fear of bad publicity and lost donors? The next morning, Naomi arrived at Willow Creek with a folder in her hand and her heart pounding. She'd called a meeting with Teresa Bond, the shelter director, and a small group of senior staff. As she entered the conference room, Blitz's absence was palpable. His presence had been a comfort to many, especially the volunteers who had grown attached to his quiet courage. Naomi placed the folder on the table and looked directly at Teresa. "You asked for proof," she said, voice steady but soft. "It's all here. The pattern of injuries, the records, and now, the camera footage." She slid the photos and the video stills across the table. For a moment, no one spoke. Teresa's hands shook as she flipped through the evidence. Other staff members exchanged uneasy glances. Naomi knew this was her moment, the fulcrum on which the fate of every animal at Willow Creek now balanced. Teresa broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. I always suspected something, but I couldn't act on a hunch. I worried it would turn into a witch hunt. We depend on every dollar, every volunteer. But this is real." Naomi nodded, her own doubts mixing with relief. If we don't act now, we become complicit. The next hours moved in a blur. Teresa called animal control and the local police. Naomi detailed her findings in a statement, hands shaking only once as she described the night she found Blitz's bruises. Animal control officers arrived quietly, reviewing records and asking questions. Naomi noticed that Eric was absent. His shift had ended early that morning, and he'd called in sick. A tension hovered over the shelter, thickening with every passing minute. While investigators combed the kennels, Naomi retreated to her office, exhausted. She poured herself a cup of jasmine tea and stared out at the drizzle clinging to the window. Her old jade pendant felt heavy around her neck, the weight both comforting and a reminder of her responsibility. She thought about the other times she'd spoken up, how often she'd been ignored or dismissed, her voice drowned out by the need to maintain peace, to avoid rocking the boat. This time was different. This time, she had proof. That afternoon, Teresa knocked softly on Naomi's door. "I wanted to thank you," Teresa said, voice thick with emotion. "I've been running this place for years, but I was always afraid. Afraid of making a scene. Afraid that one bad story would mean the end of the shelter. But you," her voice cracked, "you did what I should have done." Naomi shook her head, her own eyes misty. "You did what you could. Sometimes it just takes one person refusing to back down." Teresa sat, shoulders slumping. "You know, when I first met Eric, he seemed too good to be true. Always picking up extra shifts, never complaining. I ignored my instincts. I told myself not to judge, not to cause trouble. I can't help but wonder if I let my fear blind me." Naomi squeezed her hand gently. "We all want to believe the best in people, but now we do the right thing." As the day wore on, the news began to spread beyond the shelter. Volunteers checked in on Naomi, offering words of encouragement. A few confessed that they too had suspected something, but had kept silent for fear of overstepping. The sense of guilt and relief was palpable. That evening, with the investigation still ongoing, Naomi returned home to find Blitz waiting at the door, tail wagging for the first time, a small, trembling wave that made Naomi's heart swell. She knelt beside him, arms wrapping around his sturdy neck. "We did it," she whispered, feeling the truth settle inside her like sunlight after weeks of rain. Blitz curled at her feet as Naomi prepared a simple dinner. Later, as the city lights blinked through the window, he climbed onto her bed without invitation and pressed close, his breathing slow and even. In that moment, Naomi understood what it meant to carry the weight of another's trust, and what it meant to finally let go, just a little, of her own fears. For the first time in months, Naomi slept soundly, Blitz's presence a quiet promise that, no matter what darkness came next, neither of them would face it alone. A storm brewed again over Portland, but this time it was human anticipation, not rain, that electrified the air at Willow Creek. The past few days had unfolded in a series of tense, controlled movements, as if the entire shelter was holding its breath. Animal control and police had coordinated with Naomi and Teresa, working quietly behind the scenes. The evidence was overwhelming, but what was needed now was a public, undeniable act, something that would leave no shadow of doubt. Naomi found herself at the center of the storm, adrenaline a constant companion. She barely slept, spending her days preparing reports, and her nights replaying the footage of Blitz. Every whimper, every bruise. She'd kept Blitz close, the German shepherd now following her from room to room, never far from her reach. He'd sensed the shift. The whole building seemed to pulse with tension and expectation. On the morning the trap was set, the shelter felt almost normal. Sunlight cutting through the high windows, volunteers bustling about, dogs barking with hope. But beneath it all, staff moved with purpose, communicating in clipped whispers. Animal control had brought in an undercover officer with a rescued spaniel, Lucy, a gentle, trembling dog with eyes wide as saucers, to act as bait. Naomi's heart twisted at the thought, but Lucy was never left alone. Officers watched every angle through hidden cameras, ready to intervene at the slightest sign of distress. That night, Eric Sloan arrived for his shift as if nothing had changed. Naomi watched him from her office, Blitz pressed at her feet, heart pounding with each passing minute. On the monitors, she saw Eric do his usual rounds, checking doors, jotting notes, pausing to glance into each kennel. But when he reached Lucy's enclosure, he lingered just a little too long. Naomi's hands tightened around her mug, knuckles white. "He's moving in," whispered an officer through Naomi's earpiece. Her whole body felt electric, suspended between hope and terror. Eric scanned the hallway, then slipped into the isolation room. The cameras caught every movement, every shadow. Naomi's vision tunneled. On screen, Lucy began to whimper. Eric's figure bent down, his hand rough, voice low and clipped. For a moment, Naomi felt like she couldn't breathe. Blitz, sensing her panic, nudged her arm with his nose, a grounding, living reminder that the truth would not be hidden tonight. Suddenly, the officers moved. Uniformed animal control and police burst through the door, their voices sharp and commanding. Eric reeled back, caught in the act, hands up in shock. The live feed showed it all. No more denials, no more darkness. Naomi watched as Eric's face changed from confusion to terror. He tried to protest, but the evidence was already gathered. Hidden camera footage, witness statements, and the testimony of every animal he'd hurt. For Naomi, the minutes that followed felt both endless and blindingly quick. Eric was cuffed and read his rights. Lucy was whisked away, safe, trembling but untouched. Blitz barked softly at the sound, and Naomi realized she was crying. Silent tears of relief, fear, and exhausted victory. Outside, staff gathered in small clusters, many clutching their own rescue animals, some in tears. Naomi stepped out, Blitz at her side, and met the eyes of her colleagues. The relief in the air was palpable. She saw Marcus, the teenage volunteer with a hand on Sable's head, and Mrs. Washington, tears shining on her cheeks as she hugged an old terrier. They'd all felt the sickness growing in the shelter, but no one had known how deep it ran, until now. Teresa found Naomi near the entrance, pulling her into a fierce, wordless hug. "It's over," Teresa whispered, voice shaking. "You did it." Naomi shook her head, pressing her face into Blitz's fur. "We all did." Animal control took over, documenting every animal, checking for hidden injuries, and promising justice for each victim. News traveled fast. Within hours, the story was out. Social media lit up. #JusticeForBlitz began trending in Portland, then across the state. Donations began pouring in from strangers moved by the courage of a puppy and the tenacity of those who refused to look away. Naomi spent the rest of the night with Blitz curled at her feet, her small apartment a sanctuary at last. She answered emails from journalists, messages from volunteers, and texts from old foster siblings who'd watched her fight for every lost and broken animal since childhood. Her mentor, Carmen, called just past midnight. "You did what few have the courage to do, Naomi," Carmen said. "You believed what others wouldn't." Naomi smiled, exhausted but lighter than she'd felt in months. "I had help. Blitz. He never gave up." As dawn broke, the shelter felt transformed. The animals, sensing the shift, were calmer, more hopeful. Staff arrived early, determined to rebuild from the ground up. Blitz, once a trembling stray in the rain, now walked the halls with confidence, greeting volunteers and comforting the newly rescued. Naomi stood by the window, Blitz leaning against her leg, and watched the sun rise over Willow Creek, a shelter no longer shrouded in secrets, but alive with the promise of healing and justice. By the time the sun was fully up, Willow Creek was a different place. The news of Eric's arrest had exploded online, and by mid-morning, the shelter was flooded with calls, messages, and even news vans parked along the curb. What began as a single act of courage by Naomi and a whimper of warning from Blitz had turned into a groundswell. Naomi found herself at the heart of a movement, swept along by a current of public outrage, hope, and newfound solidarity. Inside the shelter, every face seemed changed. Staff moved with a new sense of purpose. Marcus and Jamie, the youngest volunteers, arrived early with fresh flowers for the lobby and spent their free hours making thank you Blitz cards. Teresa, usually composed, was moved to tears more than once, first by the outpouring of support, then by the realization of how close they'd come to letting the darkness go unseen. Blitz was the center of it all. No longer just a battered puppy, he became the symbol of both what had been suffered and what could be saved. He greeted volunteers with a tentative wag and let the children of visiting families pet his soft fur, standing calm even when the room filled with strangers. His old fears hadn't vanished overnight. Sometimes he still flinched at sudden noises or ducked at the sight of a raised hand. But the more love he received, the steadier he stood. Naomi saw it in the way he'd position himself between shy children and loud adults, or how he'd curl up beside anxious new arrivals in the kennels, offering silent comfort. The community's response was overwhelming. Donations poured in, cash, food, supplies, even hand-sewn blankets and toys. Local businesses set up collection jars. #JusticeForBlitz became a rallying cry across Portland. People stopped by the shelter, bringing gifts, sharing stories of their own rescued animals, and thanking Naomi for her courage. Some brought their children, wanting them to see firsthand the power of standing up for what's right. Within days, the shelter board met in an emergency session. Teresa, emboldened by Naomi's example, pushed through new protocols, expanded background checks for all staff and volunteers, updated training in trauma-informed care, and the installation of a new state-of-the-art surveillance system. No more blind spots, no more secrets. The staff voted unanimously. The pain of what had happened was raw, but it brought them closer than ever. A team, a family, united by what they'd overcome. Blitz's recovery was slow but visible, marked by small victories that felt monumental. He learned to fetch again, to chase a ball without flinching when it bounced unexpectedly. He started sleeping through the night, only occasionally waking from nightmares, soothed instantly by Naomi's gentle hand and quiet words. He found a friend in Lucy, the rescued spaniel who'd helped expose Eric, and the two would nap together in a patch of sunlight, their bodies pressed close, breathing in peace at last. Naomi herself found a new kind of healing in the weeks that followed. For the first time, she accepted help from staff, from volunteers, from the community that surrounded her. She attended meetings not as the outsider with hard questions, but as a leader, her voice respected and her instincts trusted. The wounds of her own past, years of being unheard, of shouldering every burden alone, began to knit together, not disappear, but soften at the edges. One morning, Naomi received a letter in the mail. The handwriting was childish, clumsy but determined. It was from a little girl named Mia, who had watched Blitz's story unfold with her mother. "Dear Dr. Naomi, I want to be a vet when I grow up. Thank you for saving Blitz. If I see something bad, I'll tell the truth too. Love, Mia." Naomi read the note aloud in the staff room, her voice breaking as she reached the end. The staff cheered, some wiping away tears, others hugging their own animals a little closer. In that moment, Naomi felt the true reach of their actions, not just within Willow Creek, but rippling outward, changing lives, inspiring others. Justice arrived not only in Eric's arrest and conviction, though news of his sentencing to years in prison brought a sense of closure, but in the sweeping changes across Oregon. Lawmakers, pressed by public outrage, passed new statewide animal welfare laws requiring stricter oversight of all shelters and rescues. Naomi and Teresa were invited to speak at the state capitol, sharing their experience and advocating for change. The fight wasn't over, but the tide had shifted. For Naomi, the most meaningful recognition wasn't in the headlines or the awards that soon arrived. It was in the quieter moments. Blitz pressing his head into her lap as she typed up new training protocols. A traumatized kitten purring softly in her hands. A volunteer, once wary, now beaming with pride at what their shelter had become. Healing, she realized, was never a solitary act. It was the work of many hands, many hearts, each one brave enough to care, even when it hurt. In the end, Willow Creek didn't just survive scandal, it became a beacon. New volunteers flocked to join, drawn by Blitz's story and Naomi's quiet heroism. The walls, once heavy with secrets, now pulsed with hope. Where there had been shadows, there was light. And at the heart of it all, Blitz, scarred but unbroken, led the way. Spring brought new life to Portland, and with it, a quiet, hopeful energy settled over Willow Creek. The shelter was humming again, but this time the buzz wasn't tension. It was gratitude, renewal, and a sense that every corner was touched by possibility. Flowers bloomed in the planters out front. Sunbeams spilled across the freshly painted walls. And at the center of it all was Blitz, whose journey from the shadows into light had become the heartbeat of the whole rescue. Naomi saw the change in Blitz every day. He still had his moments. A thunderstorm would roll through and he'd shiver, or a loud slam would make him retreat to a quiet corner. But he was no longer the frightened, hollow-eyed puppy she'd first held on that stormy night. Each day he grew bolder, more joyful. Blitz started spending more time outside, romping in the play yard, his fur glossy under the sun, barking with delight as other dogs joined in the chase. But the biggest change was yet to come. After weeks of recovery, therapy, and careful observation, Naomi began searching for the right family for Blitz, a home that could offer him the patience, safety, and love he needed to truly thrive. It wasn't a decision she took lightly. Every night, she weighed his progress, asking herself if he was ready to leave her side, if she was ready to let him go. That answer came one Saturday afternoon when the Parker family visited the shelter for the third time. Emily Parker, a school counselor, her husband Mark, and their 8-year-old son Tyler, had lost their old shepherd the previous fall. They'd fallen in love with Blitz, first through his story on the shelter's website, then in person. Tyler was quiet, still carrying his own scars from a school incident that had left him withdrawn, barely speaking above a whisper. Blitz seemed to sense something in the boy, just as Naomi had once sensed something in Blitz. During their first meeting, Blitz approached slowly, tail wagging, then lay down beside Tyler, head on the boy's sneakers. Tyler didn't flinch or look away. He just reached down, ran his hand along Blitz's back, and smiled for the first time in months. It was more than a match. It was healing meeting healing. By the end of the third visit, the decision was made. Naomi packed Blitz's favorite blanket, a chew toy, and his battered collar, her heart full and aching. She knelt beside him, whispering a promise in his ear. "This is your new start, buddy. I'll always be here. And you're going to help them heal, too." Blitz settled into the Parker household, as if he'd been waiting for it all along. Emily sent Naomi updates, photos of Blitz curled beside Tyler as he read, videos of their walks through the park, stories of how Blitz seemed to understand Tyler's silences and fears. The bond between them grew quickly, deep and natural, like roots sinking into nourishing soil. But Blitz wasn't done with Willow Creek. With the Parkers' blessing, he returned every week as a therapy dog in training, joining Naomi in her sessions with traumatized children and anxious animals. Blitz had a gift. He'd sit quietly beside a trembling kitten or a nervous dog, never crowding, never pushing, just present and warm and steady. For the kids, his story was a bridge. If Blitz could find the courage to trust and love again, maybe they could too. One afternoon, during a group visit from a local children's therapy center, a small girl named Sophie sat in the corner, knees drawn up to her chest, silent as stone. She hadn't spoken a word since witnessing a traumatic accident months earlier. Naomi watched as Blitz padded over, laying down a careful distance away, not looking directly at Sophie, but inching closer, until finally his head rested just beside her shoe. Sophie reached out, almost without thinking, and traced the small notch in Blitz's ear. "Doggy." It was a whisper, so soft Naomi thought she imagined it. But then Sophie said it again, stronger. The room froze. Sophie's therapist burst into tears. Naomi blinked back her own. Blitz became a legend at Willow Creek, not just a survivor, but a healer. When the official certification arrived, making Blitz a licensed therapy dog, the staff threw a celebration. Teresa gave a short speech, volunteers brought homemade treats, and the animals seemed to sense the joy that vibrated in the air. News of Blitz's transformation rippled out beyond the shelter's walls. His story ran on local news, in the Oregonian, even on national morning shows. Messages arrived from as far away as New York and Texas, all echoing the same sentiment. Blitz gave people hope. He was living proof that broken things could be made whole, that love could triumph over cruelty. Naomi stood with the Parkers one sunny afternoon as Blitz trotted between her and Tyler, both their faces lit with quiet happiness. She felt a bittersweet pride, proud of the dog Blitz had become, proud of the boy who had learned to trust again, proud of herself for having the courage to let go. She realized that Blitz wasn't leaving her. He was leading the way for everyone who still needed healing. That night, as Naomi locked up the shelter, she found a quiet peace settling over her heart. The world was still full of shadows and pain, but now she believed more than ever in the possibility of light. Blitz's journey was a testament, not just to the resilience of one animal, but to the ripple effect of compassion, courage, and connection. And somewhere across Portland, in a bedroom washed by golden dusk, Blitz slept curled at the foot of a boy's bed, finally home. The weeks turned to months, and the rhythm of Willow Creek settled into something steady, purposeful, and alive with hope. Yet even as the shelter thrived, Dr. Naomi Love found herself drawn back, again and again, to Blitz's old kennel. It was quieter now, the smell of fear long since replaced with fresh hay, lavender spray, and the gentle chorus of contented animals. Sometimes Naomi would come late after her shift and sit in the silence, her hand resting on the metal bars, remembering everything that had happened within these walls. She thought about the journey, how it had started on a stormy night with a trembling puppy, and how every step forward had been carved from doubt and uncertainty. She remembered the cold moments of isolation, her suspicions ignored, her instincts questioned, the old ache of not being believed. But she also remembered the small, persistent sparks of connection. Blitz's first wag, a volunteer's quiet confession, the way the animals huddled together for comfort when the world seemed most hostile. Naomi had always known that healing wasn't easy. It demanded risk, a willingness to care when caring could cost you everything. She thought about her own wounds, the deep scars left by years in foster care, the longing to be heard, the burning fear of failing those who needed her most. She realized, sitting in that quiet room, that courage didn't always look like a grand gesture. Sometimes, it was the simple act of not turning away from pain, from injustice, from the truth. The shelter itself was transformed. Naomi saw it in the faces of the new volunteers, the families who came to adopt, the animals who greeted each sunrise with trust instead of terror. Willow Creek was no longer just a place of rescue. It had become a beacon, a gathering space for people who believed that one act of compassion could ripple outward, changing more lives than they'd ever know. Blitz's legacy was everywhere. His old kennel, once a symbol of suffering, was now draped with thank you cards and colorful paw print paintings from children across Oregon. His story had reached thousands, inspiring not just donations and visits, but real, systemic change. New laws had passed, inspired by Blitz and Naomi's fight, regulations that meant stricter oversight, better training, and more accountability for every shelter in the state. Naomi had testified at the State House, her voice steady as she spoke for the voiceless. But her real victory was always closer to home, in the way Blitz nuzzled frightened puppies, or Tyler's laughter ringing down the hall. It was in these moments that Naomi understood the heart of their journey. The story wasn't just about catching a criminal, it was about the moral imperative, the necessity to fight for the voiceless, no matter the odds or the cost. Evil, she realized, often flourished in silence. The decision to speak out, to act, to refuse complicity, became a kind of everyday heroism that reshaped the entire shelter. One evening, as the sun slanted golden across the shelter floor, Naomi found herself alone in the quiet, reflecting. She realized that healing is never a solitary act. It is communal, stitched together by hundreds of small kindnesses, brave decisions, and hands reaching for one another in the dark. She saw it in the way Blitz, once broken, now helped heal others, in the staff who had learned to trust again, in the community that had rallied for justice and refused to forget. For Naomi, the story came full circle each time she knelt beside a new arrival. Every frightened cat, every anxious dog, every animal who trembled at the sound of human voices. She would take her time, moving slowly, offering gentle touches and patient words. She understood their fear because she had carried it herself. And in that shared vulnerability, she offered something more powerful than any medicine: hope. She thought about the American ideals at the root of their journey: justice, community action, second chances. The story of Blitz and Willow Creek spoke to something deep in the culture. The belief that no one is too small to make a difference, that justice can be demanded and delivered from the ground up, that what is broken can be made whole again. Naomi's own scars, the ones she'd carried from childhood, had given her a unique empathy, a way of seeing the silent pain in others, human and animal alike. She was not just a healer, but an advocate, a guardian of those who had no words. Blitz, with his battered ears and unbreakable spirit, was living proof that wounds, far from being only sources of pain, could become the wellspring of our greatest strengths. And so, as she sat in the quiet, surrounded by the echoes of stories past, Naomi felt something settle inside her. The shelter's transformation, the new laws, the letters from children, the daily acts of kindness, they were all part of the same truth. Healing was not a destination, but a journey. Justice was not a single act, but a way of life. And courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to face it again and again, for the sake of those who need us most. As dusk fell and Blitz trotted in, tail wagging, to rest beside her, Naomi understood. Their story would never really end. It would continue in every life they touched, every wrong they worked to right, every act of compassion that turned pain into hope. And that was enough. A year had passed since the stormy night Blitz arrived at Willow Creek. The city was in bloom, and hope stretched across Portland like sunlight through spring leaves. This was the day of the first Willow Creek Rescue Day Festival, a celebration born from pain, transformed by courage, and carried by the spirit of one battered German shepherd and the people who refused to give up on him. The shelter was unrecognizable from a year before. Bright banners fluttered at the entrance, families milled about, and laughter rose above the music drifting from the community stage. Booths offered everything from homemade dog treats to children's art projects. Dozens of dogs, many adopted, many still waiting, trotted between tables, tails wagging as strangers leaned down to pet them. Naomi watched from beneath a striped tent, feeling a profound, quiet pride at what this place had become. Blitz was, as always, at the heart of it all. He moved with the confidence of a true therapy dog now, his vest stitched with patches and pins from schools, hospitals, and shelters he'd visited. Wherever he went, children clustered around him, some shy, some giggling, some running their fingers over the small notch in his left ear, as if it were a lucky charm. Blitz greeted them all with patience, his eyes bright, never overwhelmed, never rushing away. He was no longer just a survivor. He was a bridge, connecting children, families, and strangers through the simplest acts of kindness. The Parker family arrived early, Tyler bounding ahead with Blitz's leash, Emily and Mark waving at Naomi across the crowd. Tyler looked taller, more confident, his smile quick and open in a way Naomi had only ever seen when he was with Blitz. Emily pressed Naomi's hand in both of hers. "You gave us more than a dog," she said softly. "You gave us a piece of ourselves we thought was lost." Naomi blinked back tears, overwhelmed by the weight and lightness of those words. "Blitz saved us all," she replied. "He just let us believe we were helping him." As noon approached, Teresa took the stage, her voice ringing clear. A year ago, this shelter nearly broke beneath the weight of its secrets. But today, we celebrate the courage to speak up, to heal, to turn pain into purpose. None of this would be possible without Dr. Naomi Le, the Parker family, and of course Blitz, the dog who reminded us that healing is always possible. A cheer erupted. Naomi felt herself blushing as she joined Blitz on stage. She knelt beside him, hand resting gently on his back, and the crowd grew still. She spoke not just to the guests, but to every child, every survivor, every person who had ever doubted the power of a single voice. Blitz taught us something I hope we never forget. Healing isn't about forgetting what hurt us. It's about letting compassion lead us to new beginnings. Every act of courage, no matter how small, ripples out. When you protect the vulnerable, when you speak out against wrong, you make the world safer, not just for animals, but for all of us. She paused as Blitz looked up at her, tail thumping quietly. "So today, as we celebrate, I ask you to carry his legacy forward. Be brave, be kind, and never underestimate what hope can accomplish." The applause rolled like thunder, laughter mingling with tears, children running up to hug Blitz, adults thanking Naomi for her tenacity. She spotted old faces, volunteers who had left and returned, former foster kids she'd mentored, families who had adopted. Each one had their own story, their own scars, their own healing. Naomi realized this was how legacies grew, not from fame or headlines, but from hearts changed one at a time. Later that afternoon, as the festival wound down, Naomi found herself sitting at the edge of the lawn with Blitz beside her, the Parker family stretched out on a blanket nearby. The sun dipped low, painting the sky with pink and gold. Blitz lay quietly, his head resting in Tyler's lap, tail brushing Naomi's hand. All around them, people lingered, talking, laughing, making plans for the future. Naomi looked out over the gathering and saw the world as it could be, one where every animal and every person had a place, where justice was ordinary, where compassion was the rule, not the exception. She thought about her journey, the loneliness of her childhood, the fear of speaking up, the countless nights spent fighting for those with no voice. She realized that what mattered wasn't the battles they'd won or lost, but the fact that they had fought at all, that they had refused to accept silence or cruelty as normal. She saw the difference in Blitz, too. He was the embodiment of second chances, once wounded and wary, now a source of comfort and courage to so many. His legacy was alive in every dog adopted that year, in every child who found their voice, in every law changed, and every heart opened. As the festival drew to a close, Naomi gave Blitz one last pat and stood, her heart full. She knew the work would never truly end. There would always be more animals to save, more people to reach, more darkness to chase away. But she also knew that with every act of kindness, every brave word, every outstretched hand, the world grew a little brighter. Blitz stood at her side as the sun slipped behind the trees, the last light warm on his face. Together they watched the shelter empty, the laughter echoing, the hope undeniable, Naomi realized she didn't just believe in happy endings anymore. She believed in beginnings, again and again. And so Blitz's legacy lived on, in healing, in courage, in the quiet certainty that one life, touched by compassion, could change the world.